The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the rugged expanse of the ranch. Dust swirled lazily in the warm evening air, settling on the weathered fence posts. A gentle breeze stirred, carrying the scent of hay and the distant sound of a lone hawk's call. Silas knelt by the fresh mound of earth, fingers tracing the engraved name on the weathered stone. His heart felt heavy, each beat echoing the emptiness of loss. Suddenly, a soft whimper pulled his gaze toward the edge of the graveyard. There she sat, tiny and fragile, her hair tangled like wild grass. Eloan's tear-streaked face turned upward, her eyes searching, pleading. Silence enveloped them both, a fragile bond forming in the heavy air. As she reached for him, the world faded away, leaving just the two of them, lost souls seeking warmth. And in that moment she whispered a single word, "Father." The sun hung low over the horizon, its last light spilling across the barren landscape like spilled ink. Eloan stood in the shadow of the weathered gravestone, its chipped surface a silent witness to a hollow promise. Her chest tightened, each breath a reminder of her mother's absence, each heartbeat a reminder of the betrayal that had led her here. She felt the cool breeze tugging at her tattered dress, whispering secrets of a past she couldn't escape. Just yesterday, laughter had filled their home, warmth wrapping them in a cocoon of security. But today, the world felt colder, sharper, as if the very air conspired to remind her of everything she had lost. Her brother had sold her, offered her like a prized horse at market, a transaction meant to remedy their fading fortunes. Eloan had clung to the remnants of hope, believing he would protect her, believing they were family. But as she gazed down at the grave, the finality of her mother's death washed over her like a cold wave, drowning the remnants of that trust. Tears pooled in her eyes, blurring the world around her. She had been left to navigate the wreckage of a family torn apart, her heart aching under the weight of grief and betrayal. Silas rode in on a weather-beaten stallion, dust swirling around him like ghosts of the past. The ranch stretched before him, a patchwork of land marked by toil and neglect. A sign hung limply by the gate, proclaiming the name of his family long since forgotten. He had come seeking solace from the isolation of his own empty home, an escape from the lingering specter of his wife, lost to the unforgiving darkness of illness. His eyes, hardened by years on the ranch, softened as he drew closer to the girl huddled near the grave. Silas dismounted, boots crunching on the gravel. The sight of her, tiny and fragile, like a wildflower growing in the cracks of concrete, struck him. She turned, crimson eyes swollen from tears, and for a moment, all the noise of the world faded away. The worn lines of his face deepened as he caught her gaze, a flicker of recognition igniting in his chest. He felt inexplicably drawn to her pain, a mirror reflecting his own. The air between them thickened, and in that silence he could almost hear the echoes of unshed tears and unspoken words. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice rough yet gentle, barely above a whisper. The girl blinked, confusion swirling in her eyes, and shook her head slowly. He watched as she turned back to the gravestone, her tiny fingers grazing the surface as if trying to summon the spirit resting beneath. In that moment, he understood that she was not merely a child. She was a survivor, carved from the same fierce spirit that had driven him to fight to keep his ranch alive. Eloan didn't answer. The words lodged in her throat like stones. She had long since learned that trust was a fragile thing, easily shattered by betrayal. Silas was a stranger, a man molded by the unforgiving land, and yet something in his gaze warmed her heart. A flicker of understanding, perhaps, or the ghost of kindness. But the world had taught her to guard her heart fiercely, to protect herself against the pain that had become all too familiar. She felt herself retreating within, an invisible barrier rising between them as his presence stirred emotions she had buried deep. "I'm Silas," he introduced himself, his voice carrying the weight of resilience. He stepped closer, careful not to invade her space. "You can stay here for a while if you need." The offer hung heavy in the air, like a lifeline thrown to a drowning soul. But Elowen hesitated, the shadow of her brother's decision looming large, reminding her that safety was often an illusion. She turned her eyes back to the gravestone, searching for answers in the engraved letters, in the memory of her mother's love, the only absolute she had ever known. Silas exhaled slowly, sensing the walls around her heart, the tumultuous storm that raged just beneath her fragile exterior. He felt a connection forming, fragile and tentative, rooted in loss and uncertainty. But he also felt the distance grow, like a chasm carved by grief and betrayal. He understood too well the scars that life could carve into one's spirit, and the loneliness that could linger long after the storms had passed. As the twilight settled, painting the landscape in hues of sorrow, Elowen stood alone, her thoughts a tangle of confusion. Silas remained, a quiet presence watching over her, two hearts adrift in a world that had taken so much from them. In that silence, neither spoke, each entangled in their own grief, their longing for connection clashing with their fear of vulnerability. The night deepened around them, wrapping them both in shadows, a promise of what could be, if only they dared to step into the light together. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the sprawling ranch. Dust clung to the air like memories that refused to dissipate. Elowen stepped from the creaking vehicle, her small frame swallowed by the vast, open expanse stretching before her. The ranch house loomed ahead, a weathered structure with peeling paint that whispered of both history and neglect. Silas stood in the doorway, arms crossed, the weight of years etched into his brow, his gaze lingering on the girl who had entered his life in the most tragic of ways. Elowen took a tentative step forward, eyes darting to the empty fields that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. The wind teased her hair, carrying with it the scent of hay and earth, but all she could feel was an unsettling chill that nestled deep in her bones. Silas watched her, a mix of concern and uncertainty flickering in his eyes. He cleared his throat, the silence between them stretched taut like a frayed rope. Neither spoke. There were no words that could bridge the chasm of grief or the unfamiliarity of their new life together. As dusk descended, the ranch settled into an eerie quiet. Elowen sat at the wooden table, the surface scarred and worn, reflecting a life that had known both joy and sorrow. Silas moved quietly around the kitchen, preparing a simple meal that felt more like a formality than an act of warmth. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed, punctuating the stillness. Elowen's gaze was distant, a flicker of her mother's smile lingering in her mind, a ghost that refused to release its grip on her heart. Silas placed a plate in front of her, the steam curling up like a soft invitation, but Elowen merely stared at the food, memories gnawing at her insides like a hungry animal. He sat across from her, the weight of his world pressing down on him as he tried to fathom the anguish that swirled within her like a storm. A single tear slipped down Elowen's cheek, and for a moment Silas's heart ached with a desire to reach over, to bridge the distance and offer comfort. But silence had wrapped them both in its embrace, and he felt lost, unsure of how to navigate this fragile new reality. Time passed in a disjointed rhythm, filled with chores and quiet evenings. Morning light spilled through the windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. Elowen spent her days tending to the small animals scattered about the ranch, the soft rustling of feathers and fur a balm for her grieving heart. Despite the overwhelming silence, the presence of creatures around her gradually began to ease the sharp edges of her sorrow. Silas watched her from the distance, his heart wrestling with his own demons as he forged a fragile bond with the girl who had stormed into his solitude. Yet, some evenings, the quiet would crack like glass. Elowen would retreat to the graveyard at the edge of the property, where her mother rested beneath a simple headstone, The weight of her absence was a gravity that pulled her down, and after she visited, she would return to the ranch with tear-stained cheeks, the pain raw and new every time. Silas would see her retreat to her room, the door clicking shut like a fading heartbeat, and he would feel an urgency swell within him, a need to protect her, though he remained unsure how to reach her. It was during one such evening that a fragile thread began to weave between them. Elowen sat on the porch, her legs curled beneath her, staring at the stars that blinked against the curtain of night. Silas stepped outside and leaned against the railing, their eyes meeting under the pale moonlight. Just as he opened his mouth to speak, she whispered, "Do you think she can see me?" The question hung in the air, delicate yet profound. Silas felt an ache deep within, but he nodded slowly, understanding in ways he could scarcely articulate. "I believe she can." The simple answer seemed to unlock something in Elowen as she nodded back, a fragile smile breaking through the cloud of sorrow, a fleeting moment of connection surrounding them like a warm embrace. Days turned to weeks, and with each passing moment, Elowen's sorrow transformed, folding itself into the fabric of everyday life. There were smiles now, shared laughter that echoed off the walls of the ranch. Silas marveled at how a girl who had arrived like a ghost was beginning to shine with life again. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in hues of violet and gold, Elowen looked up at him, her gaze steady and bright through the twilight. "You're like my father," she said, the words hanging between them, heavy with meaning and possibility, reshaping the contours of their lives once more. The morning sun spilled golden light across the ranch, casting long shadows as Silas stepped out of the small cabin. He found Elowen sitting on the porch, her petite figure wrapped in a thick hand-knit cardigan that seemed too big for her. She was lost in a book, her brow furrowed in concentration, oblivious to the chill in the early air. Silas paused, considering how this girl, once a fragile wisp of sorrow, had started to fill his days with a different kind of weight, the weight of responsibility, of impending connection, yet tinged with uncertainty. Their routine had settled into a rhythm over the weeks. Mornings began with Silas stoking the fire and brewing coffee, while Elowen often sketched the sprawling landscape of the ranch, the rolling hills and the towering oak trees, a world she was beginning to embrace. Then came the chores. Silas taught her how to feed the chickens, collect eggs, and tend to the garden. With each passing day he watched her transform, the red flush of adventure blooming on her cheeks, though shadows occasionally flitted across her delicate features. Memories of her mother lurked just beneath the surface, ready to engulf her during quiet moments. One afternoon, as Silas helped Elowen mend a fence around the livestock pen, he caught her staring into the distance, lost in thought. "What is it, Elowen?" he asked, his tone gentle yet probing. She hesitated, her hand stilling at the rope in her grip. "Just thinking about my mother," she replied quietly, her voice barely rising above the swaying grass. The air around them thickened, and Silas felt an instinctual urge to tiptoe around her pain, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to understand it more completely. "Tell me about her," he urged, leaning against the fence post, his eyes locked onto her. "What was she like?" The question hung heavy, and for a moment the world felt still. A flicker of pain crossed Elowen's face, her grip tightening around the rope. She was warm. She laughed a lot, even when things were hard. She loved these fields. Silas noticed the way a shadow draped over her, her words dragging like an anchor. He reached out, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder, but she shrugged away from him, the gesture sharp and sudden, as if his touch had ignited something unspoken. Silas recoiled slightly, confusion swirling within him. "I didn't mean to upset you. I just want to help," he said softly, trying to reach the elusive spark that had once brightened her eyes. Yet the more he pushed, the more distant she became. "I don't need help," Elowen snapped, her voice louder than intended. The frosty edge caught Silas off guard, and a knot formed in his stomach as he glanced away, regretting his probing curiosity. Silence enveloped them, thick and brittle, as they resumed their work, the air around them charged with unarticulated feelings. As dusk fell, they found themselves finishing their chores in relative silence, the sun casting long, weary shadows across the ranch. Ilawan, her face illuminated in the faint glow of the fading light, finally broke the silence. "Why do you care so much?" she asked, her tone softer, almost pleading. Silas turned to her, the weight of her question settling over him like a warm blanket. "Because I know what it's like to lose something," he replied, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "It's hard, and I don't want you to feel alone while you're here." For a fleeting moment, Elowen's guard seemed to waver, her eyes glistening with a hint of vulnerability, but just as quickly she masked it behind a defiant expression. "You don't know me," she whispered, almost as a challenge, as if she were daring him to dig deeper into the chasm between them. Silas felt the sting of her rebuke, but he also saw the flicker of longing in her gaze, a longing for connection, and perhaps for a father she had lost too soon. The unyielding rift between them felt both fragile and insurmountable, tethered by the shadows of their pasts. As they headed inside, Silas glanced back at the sprawling ranch, the fields now cloaked in twilight. He was grappling with a peculiar mix of gratitude and frustration. The moments shared with Elowen felt precious, yet he sensed an emotional barrier rising between them, frequently punctuated by her retreat into silence. That night, as they settled down to supper, he stole glances at her, searching for signs of the girl who had once cried beside her mother's grave. The girl who had, in a brief, unguarded moment, called him father. A part of him began to hope that beneath the layers of grief and confusion, she might be willing to let him in, even as uncertainty loomed large over them both. Silas stood at the edge of the field, the sun dipping low and casting long shadows across the rugged earth. He could hear the distant call of crows settling in for the evening, their hoarse calls echoing like ghosts across the expanse. Ilawan was in the barn, her small frame hunched over a stall, her fingers tracing the letters of her mother's name carved into the wood. Silas clenched his jaw, feeling a pang in his chest. He had taken her in, believing he could provide comfort, but in moments like these, the weight of their shared loss felt unbearably heavy. The air inside the barn was thick with the scent of hay and horses, yet it seemed empty, much like the conversations they shared lately. Silas watched Elowen as she spoke softly to the animals, her voice barely above a whisper. It cut deeper than any blade. He had thought his presence would fill the void, but each day he found himself drifting further from her. She treated him with a formality that made his heart ache. Their bond felt like a fragile thread, twisted and frayed, waiting for a single pull to unravel it completely. "Are you okay?" he finally called out, his voice breaking the silence, sending a shiver through the rafters. Elowen's head jerked up, surprise painted across her features. It was a question he had wanted to ask for days, but every time he opened his mouth, the right words remained just out of reach. Her eyes flickered with something, shame or vulnerability. He couldn't quite place it. "I'm fine," she replied, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Silas noticed the way she shifted her gaze away, focusing on the ground, as if the dust could somehow shield her from the truth. He took a step closer, unnerved by the distance that seemed to stretch between them, an invisible chasm neither of them knew how to cross. "You don't have to pretend with me, Elowen. I know you're hurting." Her hands tightened into fists at her sides, nails digging into her palms as if trying to contain her pain. "What do you know about my hurt? You don't know anything." The words burst forth, raw and jagged, cutting through the fragile atmosphere, splintering it like a brittle branch underfoot. Silas flinched, taken aback by the intensity of her outburst, the fierce emotion that seemed to rise like smoke from her heart. "I'm trying to understand," he said softly, hoping to tether her anger, to coax out the fear that lay beneath it. "You're not alone in this." As soon as the words left his lips, he felt a wave of despair wash over him. The reality of his own failures had settled heavily on his shoulders, and he worried that he was pulling her into a darkness he couldn't escape himself. It's okay to feel lost. We're both just trying to find our way. Elowen's breath hitched, and for a moment he thought he might catch a flicker of comprehension in her eyes. But then the moment passed, and a shadow clouded her expression. "You think you can help me?" The bitterness in her voice was palpable, and it struck Silas to his core. "You're just a rancher, and I'm just a girl who lost everything." The tears she had been holding back spilled forth, streaming down her cheeks like the rain he had wished for weeks to fall, her shoulders shaking with the weight of her grief. Silas took a step closer, an instinctive urge to comfort her battling with the fear of rejection. "I might not have the answers, but I can be here for you, Elowen. I want to be here." But even as he said it, the uncertainty gnawed at his insides. What did she see in him? A father? A protector? Or merely a stranger cast into her life by some cruel twist of fate? The hard reality hung in the air, heavy with unspoken words, and the fear that he might never truly belong in her world. As silence fell, Elowen's gaze met his, and in that moment, the world around them faded. They stood on the precipice of something profound, a shared vulnerability that threatened to burst forth, yet remained just out of reach. The air crackled with unexpressed emotions, and for the first time in too long, Silas felt a flicker of hope, even amid the pain. They were two lost souls, grappling with their grief, yearning for a connection that felt tantalizingly close, yet terrifyingly distant. A promise of healing waiting to unfold amidst the shadows of their past. Elowen stood in the pale light of dawn, the farmyard still wrapped in a blanket of early morning mist. The air held the crispness of a recently fallen frost as she watched Silas tending to the horses. Each fluid movement of his hands, the way he brushed down their coats and cooed soft reassurances, plucked at the strings of something deep within her. It was a rhythm she had never known, and a part of her longed to be as grounded as those creatures in his care. She had spent so long feeling like a ghost, drifting through memories of her mother, but here, amidst the living and the breathing, she was beginning to feel the flickering pulse of life anew. Silas turned, catching her with his gaze, and in that brief moment, the air between them shimmered with an unspoken understanding. He approached Elowen, his hands smeared with the earthy remnants of his morning chores. "How about you help me with the feed today?" His voice was warm yet steady, a beacon in the silence of the barn. Elowen nodded, her heart pounding as she took a step closer to him, the distance between them collapsing like the walls she had built around herself since her mother's death. As they moved through the barn together, Elowen felt the weight of his presence beside her. Silas was efficient, quick to show her how to measure out the grain and fill the buckets. Yet every so often he would pause, glancing her way with a kindness that felt new and fragile. Each shared glance wove threads of connection between them until the unthinkable happened. In a moment of simple, clumsy vulnerability, Elowen spilled the grain, a cascade of golden flakes that danced across the barn floor like a falling star. Elowen covered her face in embarrassment, but then Silas laughed, a deep, rolling sound that echoed through the barn. The warmth of his laughter enveloped her, easing the flutter of anxiety in her chest. "It happens to the best of us," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. With a shared moment of levity, the space that had once felt cavernous closed in, as if the walls were leaning closer, wrapping them in a bubble of comfort and safety. In that sanctuary of laughter, Elowen felt a shift within her. The ache of loss still lingered, but it became a dull thrum rather than the sharp pang that had haunted her since her mother's passing. She began to glimpse Silas, not just as the rancher who had taken her in, but as someone who offered a quiet strength, a family she had thought lost forever. While they worked, she found herself stealing glances at him, noting the way his brow furrowed in concentration and the flecks of grey in his hair that spoke of a life lived with hard truths. Later, as they set the feed down, Silas took a moment to watch her as she stirred in the muck, her small hands struggling yet earnest. In his expression was a flicker of something profound. "You're stronger than you know, Elowen," he said softly, almost as if sharing a secret. The simple acknowledgement set her heart alight, filling the empty spaces that had once seemed insurmountable. She looked up, her eyes meeting his, and for an instant the world around them faded, leaving only the connection they were forging, fragile yet unmistakable. As the sun climbed higher, casting golden rays through the barn's open windows, Silas handed her a brush. "Want to help me groom Starfire?" He gestured toward the majestic mare standing nearby, her coat glistening with sunlight. Elowen's eyes widened at the responsibility, her mind racing with self-doubt. But as she approached the horse, Silas stayed by her side, guiding her with gentle words. Their fingers brushed, his calloused, hers soft, and an electric spark ignited, making her heart race. In that fleeting touch, Elowen felt the first stirrings of something she had longed for: belonging. As they worked together, brushing the mare's mane until it shimmered, Elowen allowed herself to breathe deeper, to let go of the lingering shadows of her past. Silas spoke of his life, stories of lessons learned among the animals, and a sense of trust began to form in the silence between their words. With every stroke, Elowen felt herself expanding, her heart unraveling like a skein of yarn, revealing the threads of love and hope she thought she had lost. In the quiet intimacy of that moment, Elowen turned to Silas, her eyes glistening. "I can't remember the last time I felt this alive." The weight of her admission hung in the air, a fragile offering between them. Silas paused, setting the brush down and looking into her eyes, and in that shared stillness, he reached out to tuck a stray hair behind her ear. "You're not alone anymore, Elowen." His words settled around her like a warm embrace, and as she took in the sincerity of his gaze, she whispered, "Father." The word enveloped them, the significance of it dancing delicately between hope and healing, and in that single utterance, a new chapter of their lives began to unfold. Elowen stood at the edge of the field, her heart racing like a wild stallion, caught between the ache of unsaid words and the fear of breaking the fragile bond she had formed with Silas. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and lavender, but all she could see were the shadows of her memories, the laughter of the past intertwined with the haunting silence that now enveloped her. Each breath felt heavy, laden with unexpressed thoughts that twisted in her mind like a tempest. Silas was tending to the horses, his broad shoulders outlined against the golden light, moving with a calm grace that she had come to admire. He whistled softly as he worked, each note weaving through the air and wrapping around her, coaxing her closer to the warmth of his presence. Yet each step forward felt like trudging through thick mud, as if the weight of her unspoken longing anchored her to the ground. She wanted to call out to him, to bridge the chasm of silence that had grown since the day he took her in, but the words faded before they could escape her lips. The memory of her mother echoed in her mind, always tinged with pain, yet filled with love. She remembered the stories told in soft whispers, the lessons of strength and resilience. Silas had become her sanctuary, a stout pillar in her chaotic world, but his kindness only deepened the conflict within her. Would he still want her if she unleashed the tempest of emotions locked within? Or would he send her away, just as her fears whispered? Elowen clutched the hem of her shirt, fingers trembling. The field stretched before her like an unending sea, and each blade of grass seemed to murmur secrets that eluded her. She needed to break the silence, to shatter the invisible wall that stood between them. The word "father" lingered in her mind, pulsating with a significance that terrified her. What if she was wrong? What if it was too soon? Courage surged within her as she watched Silas lift his gaze, the warmth in his eyes sparking a flicker of hope. He looked at her as if she was a light in his life, and the sight ignited flames of desperation and longing. The flicker of fear receded, replaced by a yearning to share her truth. But when she opened her mouth, the silence echoed back, a cruel reminder of the chasm that still lay unbridged. In that moment, a wave of emotion struck her heart like a tidal wave, overwhelming and cleansing all at once. The memories of her past, the loss of her mother, and the warmth she felt with Silas pressed upon her, demanding release. The desire to speak twisted into desperation, and she could almost taste the freedom of voicing her truth. To call him father felt like both an honor and a risk, yet it was a title she longed to claim. Tears pooled in her eyes and she blinked them back, unwilling to hide behind the shield of silence any longer. She took a deep breath, grounding herself in the moment, feeling the earth beneath her feet. This was her chance, a chance to redefine her world, to mend the fractures in her heart. Silas, she whispered at first, the name slipping free on a gentle breeze. It was a tender call, filled with unrestrained affection that reverberated through the air. Silas turned fully toward her, the warmth in his eyes shifting into a silver spectrum of curiosity and concern. It was as if the sun shone brighter when he looked at her, illuminating the depths of her turmoil. She swallowed hard, willing the fear down. She hesitated, her voice trembling yet strong. I want to say something. The weight of unspoken words hung heavy between them, and for the first time, Elowen realized that in the act of speaking she might just find the strength to release her fears. The battle inside her raged on, but the urge to be seen, to be known, overpowered her trepidation. The naming of him, of them, became her lifeline, pulling her from the depths of despair into a new dawn of connection. With steady resolve, she uttered the words that had danced upon her tongue for so long. Silas, will you be my father? The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting an amber haze across the sprawling fields. Elowen sat cross-legged in the grass, the warm earth beneath her, grounding her in a way nothing else had since her mother's passing. Silas watched her from the porch, the wooden planks creaking under his weight as he leaned against a post. The last rays of sunlight caught in Elowen's hair, transforming it into a cascade of gold, and Silas felt a quiet ache in his chest. She was no longer just a girl he had taken in. She was a part of him, and yet a world between them still loomed. Elowen turned her gaze towards the old oak tree that stood sentinel over her mother's grave, its branches stretching wide as if trying to embrace the memories buried beneath. Silence hung in the air, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was a moment of shared understanding. Every day had been a step on a long road toward healing, and today felt different, charged with an electric tension that sent ripples through the atmosphere. Silas! The name slipped from her lips, a whisper caught in the breeze, and Silas felt the air shift around him like a soft caress. He hadn't realized how much he'd yearned to hear her voice call for him. She was finally reaching out, willing to bridge the distance they had circled for weeks. He loved the way his name tasted on her lips, a melody woven into the fabric of their shared life. He stepped off the porch, crossing the yard with slow, deliberate strides, each step matching the thud of his heart. Elowen? The name felt heavy and full, imbued with all the weight of the life they had built together. He knelt beside her, their eyes locking in a moment that felt as vast as the sky. The sun dipped lower, painting shadows on her face, and he resisted the urge to reach out and touch her. "Do you think she's proud of me?" Elowen finally asked, her voice trembling like the leaves rustling above them. Silas felt the depth of her yearning, the ache of loss that mirrored his own. He had watched her struggle to fill the void, to find her footing in a world that felt so cruelly altered. "I try every day to remember her," she added, looking down at her hands, fingers entwined in the blades of grass. "She is," Silas replied, his voice softer now, echoing the sincerity in his heart. "You carry her with you, Elowen, in everything you do." He could see the flicker of hope ignite in her eyes, the glimmer that suggested she believed him. Their connection was unraveling into something more, It was woven into the threads of life and loss, a tapestry made from grief and resilience. As moments drifted by, Elowen took a deep breath. "I've been thinking," her voice trailed off, a slight quaver breaking the surface, "about what it means to have a family again." Silas felt a tightening in his chest, a swell of emotion he had been trying to keep at bay. For so long, he had been a solitary figure, haunted by his own past. Elowen offered him a glimpse of something he had nearly given up on: hope. "Silas," she said, and the name hung in the air like a prayer. "I want you to know that I see you. You aren't just the man who took me in. You're becoming my father." Indeed, the word fell from her lips, a revelation bursting forth, and it shattered the air between them. They were two souls merging into one, navigating the journey of grief and love together, forging a family in the fires of loss. Tears glistened in Elowen's eyes, and Silas felt his heart swell, the walls he had built around himself beginning to crumble. "Elowen," he breathed, the weight of her words anchoring them both. In that moment, they were not just a struggling rancher and a grieving girl. They were something new, forged by understanding and affection, names intertwined in the quiet beauty of the evening light. As the stars began to emerge overhead, the world faded away, leaving only the promise of new beginnings wrapped in the enduring bond they had created together. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue across the sprawling fields, where the whispers of the wind carried tales of loss and rebirth. Elowen knelt beside the weathered stone, fingers tracing the engraved letters of a name she could barely remember. Silas stood a few paces back, the weight of the world etched into his furrowed brow, yet softened by the bond they had forged. As twilight deepened, Elowen rose slowly, her heart full, yet heavy. She turned to Silas, a silent question lingering in the air. He nodded, understanding what words could not encapsulate. In the stillness, she stepped closer, her small hand reaching for his, fingers threading through his calloused palm. Together, they walked toward the edge of the graveyard, where wildflowers danced in the evening breeze. Silas knelt, gently pulling a sprig of lavender, its scent an echo of reassurance. He tucked it behind her ear, a quiet promise of protection. Elowen tilted her head, a soft smile breaking through her grief, and in that moment the world faded away. In the embrace of dusk, they stood together, not merely as a struggling rancher and a girl, but as a father and daughter, bound by heart, forever entwined in the silence of love.